Happy Valentine's! It's time to do pinwheels with the Hugs and Kisses quilt.
Hi quilters. Today we're going to be working on the Valentine quilt that you see here. I'm using a fabric that's called Hugs and Kisses. It's by Benartex. And I wanted to do something for Valentine's that didn't require a lot of fussy cutting, and I think this pinwheel quilt will be perfect. We'll be going over a very quick way to do the whole quilt top.
The design pack that I'm starting with is Hugs and Kisses by Benartex. It has 42 10 by 10 inch pieces in it. When you flip this layer cake over, you can see the fabric designs that I'm going to be working with today. And you can also see that I'm going to be using a fabric strip set by the same company, and it has 42.5 inch by 42 inch strips in it. Now that my fabric pack is opened, I want to lay out light and dark colors together in order to get a strong contrast as I'm working on this. There may be a few values that are similar as far as the color goes, but they still should form a strong contrast in order to get this to work nicely. Now that you have your fabrics all paired up and right sides together, you want to take your stack over to your machine, and then you want to sew around all four sides of each of your fabric pairs. Now what you see is on the outside of your fabric, the wrong sides are showing, and it's been sewn all the way around. Your right sides will be on the inside, and we'll cut those in just a minute. Now when you take your first slice of this, going corner to corner using your ruler, what you're going to see on the inside is what looks like a pita pocket when you open it up. And this is perfectly correct. Now you're going to move on from this, and what I recommend is doing your whole stack. So you've got your whole stack of colors, and you have it sewn all the way around the outside. Now you want to just lay these on your cutting mat, and you want to line them up basically where you can cut corner to corner. So you're going to need a good amount of space. And what I'm going to show you here is what actually happens if you separate these. It's much better if you cut these in one complete motion corner to corner and then turn your mat. What I did on this one was I didn't turn my mat, and as you can see, it's going to get a lot more difficult for me as I'm working to put the two pieces together. You're going to have them lined up in both directions on a line so that you can line up your ruler, and if you separate them at all to look at them, then you're going to have a little bit of trouble. I turned my mat because, or I didn't turn my mat because I was doing a top-down camera, and there just wasn't room underneath my tripod for this. But I would recommend not doing this in the future and just turning your entire mat. It'll make it so much easier. So you can see that you have to fiddle a lot with this as you're going through. And since you have quite a few of these to do, you want to make it as easy on yourself as possible and with as little work. So if you never move your fabric sections, you'll do a lot better on this. After you make your second cut, you're going to begin to see your half square triangles emerge very quickly from this. This to me is a very encouraging part of the quilting process because I've done half square triangles. There's different methods of making them, and this one is very quick. And the advantage of that is it's got great big pieces that you're working with too. And this finished block will end up at 13 inches square. So it will be a nice big block that you do each time. And as you probably have guessed, a great big block means that you get finished with your quilt very quickly. So I'll move on to pressing these, and you want to press to the dark side with all of these. And if you do this across your whole quilt, it's going to give a uniform way to the way everything lines up. So I'm pressing to the dark side. When I do these, I roll my fabric over. And so there are different ways that you can line these up. Notice that you have a secondary pattern and you also have a pinwheel pattern. So there are different ways that you can always do a half square triangle. They're all pretty and they're very enjoyable. Now, one of the things that you're going to want to do when you do your pinwheels is you want to cut off your dog ears. And that's what you see me doing here. I'll go around and this is honestly something, if you're watching TV or something, you can do these as you're working, and that way you've got a whole stack of these. It's going to take you a few minutes to do them, but it'll help remove some of the bulk, and that's the reason that you do this. So you're just going up, you're lining up your scissors with a straight line on your segment of your block, and you're just trimming these off even. Once you've removed the bulk, the next thing that you want to do is create a test block. And I've set these up in a pinwheel, and I've used a standard 1/4 inch seam. And so you want to check your block at this time. You want to press it out, make sure that your points come together nicely, and you want to, here you can see I roll that seam over from the top, and you just gently ease it over a little bit at a time. And what you're looking for is to make sure that you get a nice pointy center, and that's what you're aiming for. And after you've done this, you can see that the next thing I've done is I've butted 2 of these blocks up together. You see your primary pattern, and you also see a secondary block emerging from this. And this would be what you would see if you left these together. Now I've got all of these to work through, and there's quite a few of them. So for each of these that's showing, there's like a stack of 4. And so it's going to take a while to press all these out, but that's the next step. You're just going to open them up, and you're going to press all of these, like I said, to the dark side. And this is something that actually goes very quickly as you're doing it. Now you see me and I've laid this on my cutting mat. Don't do that. Be sure and lay it on your ironing mat when you're working on it. And here you see I've got the whole stack ready to go, and I'm going to move on to the next thing. So I'm down to my last few subunits now. And there's a few things that I need to point out. If you've not been working with half square triangles, it's very, very easy to get your orientation messed up when you're working with these. There's a couple of ways that you can do that will keep you in line. One way is just to have, once you have one made, just to follow that pattern and keep it somewhere just off in the distance so that you can see it and follow that pattern. When I'm working on the pinwheels, I like to make sure that I have whichever one is the darker value, I want it to be facing down on my right hand side. And as I go, I'll just pivot these around. And this is helpful for me, so I'll just start pivoting and turn again, and then turn again. And so that'll lay out the pinwheel very quickly for me. But it always is really, really helpful if you double check to make sure that your orientation is right when you're sewing these up. From this point on the assembly, all you need to do is turn them over like this and like this. As I'm assembling these, you'll notice that there is a bulky piece right here where you have seams from this and the other seams that coordinate. You want to make sure that these seams nest together, and that just kind of means they sort of hug each other when you put them together. So you want to make sure that they nest very well. Now, when I'm doing these, I will take them over to the machine and I will sew like this. This top one I will usually flip over so that I'm feeding the bulky side into the machine first, and then I'm coming over to the side that has no seams on it. So this one I do actually flip, And then the next one, the bottom one, is lined up actually pretty right. And so you just want to make sure that your seams nest where you start. That gives you the nice crisp point. Let me move over to this one here. This is one where I've sewed the subunits together so that you can see what you're going to get next. A couple of things that I might want to mention right here and now has to do with ironing. When you press these, you want to press to your dark side. And you'll notice that, I'm embarrassed. There you go. Your dark side here, if you press this way, and you just roll your seam over as you go, and your dark side is over here. So you just roll your seam over. It's on the underside, but it should just follow your iron. And you'll have about 1/4 of an inch on each piece. So when you turn these pieces over, they will nest nicely too. I will usually, I've been using for this whole thing, I have 3 pins. I pin right here where I want my points to come together. I pin at the ends where I want my seam to start and where I want my seam to end. And so when I take it to the sewing machine, these places are the critical places. The critical place for this one is the point. So I will take a pin, let me grab one right here, and I will run it. You don't necessarily have to run it through right there, but you want to make sure that your seams are nesting. They're just hugging each other right in the middle, and you want to make sure that you start and you end well. When you do that, you should open it up and press again. And what you want to have is, let me get this one right here. You want all of your points to come together. Now, if your points don't come together, it's not necessarily a tragedy. Most of us aren't being judged. Like we're not taking our quilts to a quilt show and being judged, and people that receive it. One thing is that we have an orderly mind. And what that means is that our mind will correct for mistakes. You might notice it when if you're typing something and you make an error, that when you read it back, you don't necessarily catch it because, one, you know what you want to say, and also our mind will correct for mistakes like that. So if this is a little bit off, usually the person that's viewing, unless they're coming around looking very, very closely for mistakes, as in the case of like a judged quilt show, they're not going to see these right off. And if you're standing at a distance, probably not at all. So if your points are a little off, it's not a tragedy. If it really, really bothers you, you're probably the only one that is going to notice. I've given away a lot of quilts, and I've never had anybody come back and say, "Oh, I see this error right here that you made." That usually doesn't happen. And once they're not with me, I don't notice that there's a problem at all. So with something like that, it depends how much something bothers you. Another thing about this point place is this is a very, very bulky place that you might have to work with. If you want to, and I don't generally do this, but you can see when you look at your seams that there's a lot of bulk right there. That's going to be problematic if you hit it with even with a sewing machine. When you hit something like that, it is an opportunity for a needle to break because it's just so much that your needle's going through. If it just bends it off a little bit, it will hit your needle strike plate and you might break a needle. You can open this up and reduce some of the bulk. So you could come right in and open up your seam right there, and that would reduce some of the bulk when you're quilting. So that I don't generally do it, but you can open up this seam and that will take away some of the bulk. And that is really the only one that's critical on something like this if you want to do that and you want to make it easier for yourself. Another thing that you could do is just make it a point not to have your quilting cut. If you're doing something free motion, make sure that you don't hit that place right there. Just come around it very close. Here I have the section that I was working on. When you open it up, the first thing that you want to do is check that you are satisfied with how your point comes on it. And then you're going to close it back up and give it a little press here. This, I don't know what heat setting this point does, but it makes it a little bit more cooperative, your fabric, when you roll it back over. So you want to open it up. I generally will press away from myself, and you just want to roll your iron over your seam so that it pushes it in one direction. So your whole seam is going to go in that upward direction underneath your fabric. And like I said, you got to look and be satisfied with your points. It's always good to do that before you press completely. Then you want to flip it over on the back and make sure everything's laying down nicely. This will aid you greatly when you're coming back later to do your quilting if everything lays down. If you're sending it out to a long armor, keep in mind that they are charging for their labor and the time involved. So if they have to go back and correct for things that you haven't done, you're going to be paying for that also. So that is, keep your long armor in mind if you're sending it off. If you're quilting it yourself, give yourself a break and make it as easy as possible. Here you want to be sure and press toward the dark on these half units. And the same to this one. I'm going to press it toward the dark side. And the reason that you do that is so that you don't have a seam, a red seam that's showing through your white fabric. And now you've got like a 1/4 inch between where your points come together, and you'll just take this back over and sew it. Sew it back over here, and just like the others, you just give it a little heat press there. Open it up and check that your points come together. And close it back up. Now I'm moving on to putting I've put the sashing on, and this is actually around the outside of my block. So the sashing that I've decided to use is the same it's the same design that I used on the layer cakes, and this is in 2.5 inch strips. So same design, same company doing everything, makes for a nice design. One of the things that you might consider when you're putting your strips on for your sashing or for your outside border is if there is any fullness in your quilt, you have an opportunity when you cut your strips to make them exactly the same and to pull that fullness back in or stretch it a little bit out. So my finished block is 13 inches by 13 inches. So I want my strips all to be 13 inches. And if there is any fullness, this is the way that I would take care of that. I would start with a seam and just make sure that it nests nicely, and I would pin that in. And then I would come over to the end and I would make sure that it lines up just perfectly on the edge, and I would pin in here. And then I'm going to look for any fullness in between. You can see there's really not any here. But if there were fullness, just because this is 13 inches, it's a good bit of opportunity for things to slide on the quilt. I would pin on the center. So the same for the fullness. If you have fullness, you want to take it in right there. And let me pretend there's a little bit of fullness. Say you've got a bulge somewhere over here and you want to bring it in, then you would come halfway between and you would make sure that the fullness is divided between here and the end and between here and this next pin. And you might even put another pin in here depending on how much that you have. The reason that you might get fullness is these are cut on the bias, and so they have a tendency to stretch with handling. So if you're handling something like this a lot, it's got that opportunity to stretch. If you don't have fullness, really celebrate that and enjoy that you don't. And so with these on my outside border, let me pull it over here. I have little cornerstones and I have my sashing, and for everything around the block it's cut at 13 inches, and these little cornerstone pieces that I'm using here are cut at 2.5 by 2.5. So the 2.5-inch strips, and once you lose your seam allowance, you'll have like a 2-inch strip throughout your entire fabric, like that, or for your quilt through the entire thing. So you just want to come through and keep pinning. Always make sure, this is a place where, to me, it's worth it to pin. There's a lot of times I don't use pins because it just slows me down. But right here, when you're doing this kind of thing, it can really help to have it pinned because it's such a large piece of fabric. And the larger the fabric goes, the more opportunities you have for everything to slip out of place. So a little bit of pinning can help a lot with that. There's one other thing that you might want to think about when you're cutting your strips. So this has to do with pressing. When I'm pressing these, I've gone through with an iron and I've just pressed my little cornerstones outward. Let me turn this over so you can see what this looks like. So I have my cornerstones and they've been pressed outwards, and that way they will nest really nicely to the next piece of sashing that comes from the opposite direction. So you want to keep that in mind as you're going through with something like this, that keep your pressing to where everything lays nice and flat as you're working on it. So right here you can see there's a tiny bit that this one is going to need to pull in the fullness here just a tiny bit to make that work. And I'll just come in and pull that and pin it. And then this one looks fine. And I'll come back through and pin that one right in the center. And then I'll take it to my machine and sew it.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for more compulsive quilting videos.